Pode ser o Grupo Corpo ou a Companhia de Dança do Pantanal, Museu de Arte Moderna de São Paulo ou Arte em Cores, Filarmônica de Minas Gerais ou Programa Vale Música. Onde tem cultura, a Vale está. Dos projetos que todo mundo já conhece, até aqueles projetos que todo mundo precisa conhecer. É valorizando essa cultura que crescemos e evoluímos juntos.
Com o apoio do Instituto Cultural Vale, a arte popular é destaque no Maranhão.
E o nosso papel é fazer com que elas sejam conhecidas, valorizadas.
Vale, transformar a mineração hoje é transformar o amanhã de todos.
Ministério do Turismo e a Associação Casa Azul apresentam 20ª Flip Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty. O projeto conta com benefício da Lei Federal de Incentivo à Cultura. Vale Mais Cultura. Tem patrocínio oficial do Instituto Cultural Vale. Patrocínio Itaú. Copatrocínio O Globo. Apoio Esquilo, Mac Móveis, Prefeitura de Paraty, Globo Livros, Unigel, CQSFV Advogados e Oceana. Concepção Associação Casa Azul. E realização Secretaria Especial da Cultura, Ministério do Turismo, Pátria Amada Brasil, Governo Federal.
Ninguém imaginava a potência que seria a Flip, nem o poder transformador que um evento teria aqui em Paraty. E a gente foi, e eu acompanhei todo esse processo, como vai ser, qual é o desenho. Tem um conto da Marina Colassante, agora eu não lembro o nome, que ela fala, como você desenha um cavalo. Tira tudo do que não é cavalo e daí você terá o cavalo. É um conto maravilhoso. Então é isso, essa conta reversa, né? Tira tudo o que foi a Flip todos esses anos e você vai pensar o que seria Paraty sem ela. E a história da Flip ela é tão imbricada, ela é tão orgânica com Paraty que é difícil imaginar. É como se ela sempre estivesse ali, até porque a cultura é como se desembocasse na Flip todo um processo de construção cultural que Paraty vem desde muito tempo, desde a época da ditadura e anterior a ela, desde do Zé Kleber e do cinema novo que se fez porque existia Paraty, que todo mundo, o isolamento de Paraty que propiciou que os intelectuais viessem para cá. E assim como a Festa do Divino, né, que é feita a tantas mãos, eu acho que a Flip é isso, porque ela é feita a muitas mãos e as mãos de muitos paratienses. E não são só os paratienses que às vezes que carregam, que são contratados, não. A gente tem muitos paratienses pensando no evento. em posição de protagonismo mesmo. Então acho que essa é a grande diferença que torna a Flip tão especial e tão singular, né?
Flip 20 anos. Vidas que transformam lugares, que transformam pessoas. Escreva conosco essa história. Faça parte da rede amiga da Flip para continuarmos transformando juntos os próximos 20 anos. Acesse flip.org.br e faça sua doação.
Now, let's go and get started. Good morning. Songs by the seaside to a friend. I saw her rosy lips, a hymn to love, her voice. Her sweet, fluid voice was cadenced, cooing a vague murmur. Her languid eyes had such a beautiful expression, so bewitching, so seductive, that I deemed her an angel. There she is, fairy or archangel or cloud announcing the dawn. I saw her, her breasts heaving, and she took note of who heard her. I know not what phrase that was. Only he spoke to her. Only she understood the phrase. I was so jealous. I would have been jealous of numbers themselves if they spoke of love to her. Because only I could want her, but she gave a sweet, charming smile to another, and she forgot me for him, alas. Veronica Stigger. Good morning, one and all. I'm Pedro Meira Monteiro from the curatorship with Milena Brito and Fernanda Bastos. It's a huge pleasure to introduce the first roundtable of the third day of Flip today, the title of which is We Still Have Long Struggles Ahead of Us. Most of the titles of the roundtable come from Maria Firmina dos Reis and her writing. A roundtable of what was left and what still challenges in modernism in Brazil, this young and old, 100-year-old process. With the enthusiasm of the moment, Neymar Richardson comes on stage to the O Globo said the following. Richardson, when they ask me, why do you take positions, I think the best question is, for whom do you take positions and take a stand? Turning one question into another question, I'd like to call forward to the stage two writers and thinkers, Allan da Rosa and Eduardo Sterzi. Referring to Richardson taking his stand as usual in the defense of human rights, the Brazilian football star. And Eneida Leal will be the chair, who's a professor, full professor of Brazilian literature at the Federal University of Bahia, and also an associate professor in the Catholic University in Rio de Janeiro. A message, the excerpts that will be read are spread around on the chairs. Okay, enjoy the roundtable. Good morning, everyone. We meeting again. Here we are again at the beginning of this day, this wonderful day, but today's the last day for me. So good morning and welcome, everyone. Let's begin this second meeting, and before anything else, I'd like to state briefly and publicly, but stating something very important. The week of modern art of 1922 and 2022 is the year the death of Lima Barreto, is the Brazilian writer. On November 1st in 1922, at 41 years of age, Lima Barreto died. He was younger than the two writers who are sitting on the stage with me. Having said that, I want to introduce my two colleagues. Allan da Rosa is a writer, historian, a radio announcer, documentarian, critic, and curator of several different visual works and writings by black authors. He's an activist for culture, arts, and black policies. He has a master's and a PhD from the University of São Paulo. He circulates amongst black moves, the peripheral movement of São Paulo and Coperifa, amongst the imaginary, the body, and saliva, and the pen, as he says, all combined. He writes and publishes, and has, since Vain, his book from 2005, A Mother's Prayer, the Theater of Kabula, and children's books like Zagai and Zumbi, Scares Whom, essays on various different topics. Allan published this year Waters of Black Men's Imaginary and Reckoning and Ancestry, São Paulo in the 19th century to the 21st century. He's going to launch tomorrow at FIP, Aesthetics, Foundations, Basics, Lips, and Body Language. So, Eduardo Sterzi is a poet, playwright, literary critic, professor of university at the University of Campinas, participated in curating exhibits in dialogue with this roundtable with variations on the savage body. Eduardo is Viveiro de Castro, photographer, that resulting in a book. And unveiling to 2022, an exhibit. It's still underway. He studies poetry and many poets of the classics, from the classics to the modernists. He published Why Do We Read Dante? The Task of Joy, the Heaven of the Future, 5 essays on Augusto de Campos this year, in rereading modernism, in addition to numerous debates, live conferences. He just launched in São Paulo, I Miss the World, News of Anthropophagy. These are our two guest authors, poets, playwrights. I'm going to propose to both of them that, based on a brief discussion on modernism, on Brazilianism and modernism, that they have an initial time now, a little bit longer than the subsequent dialogue, to take stands and say whatever they want concerning the issue that we're going to be discussing here this morning. For most Brazilians, men and women who are literate, the Week of Modern Art from 1922 acquired a huge dimension of currentness that to this day the ideas and writings still impact us as if they were our contemporaries. They are the main events of cultural history and literary history of Brazil. The cultural tradition and artistic tradition that they designed in 1922 to this day sustains the country's imaginary, at least the imaginary, the hegemonic imaginary of the country. 100 years after modernist Brazilianism, there are several different paths to deal with the grandeur. One, we can celebrate modernist Brazilianism. This does not necessarily mean to revere as was proposed, but rather to remember together, to commemorate, to remember, reassess, and redefine. Or, on the other hand, we can also, with the begging dememorize. It does not mean to erase, efface, or deny, but to place centrality for other events and other voices, especially other memories and imaginaries to converse with us, to circulate other creators, other landscapes and plots and characters, for us to have another understanding of our actual reality. With this provocation and teasing our two writers, I turn the floor over to both of them. First of all, Eduardo Sterzi. Talking about the week of modern art in 1922, and modernism is always rather problematic. The point of departure is normally this, to a certain extent, what you said. In other words, it's a myth, a monument, it's something to be celebrated. This nature of celebration is rather complicated because, to a certain extent, the idea of celebration itself has a duplicity. It's to celebrate together or commemorate, but this together of co-memory. Who shares in this commemoration and who's left out of it? But thinking of the etymology, commemorate has another meaning. This co is an intensive co. In other words, it's the shared, not only commemorating together, but commemorating and remembering in a more intense way. And another thing we have to consider, what is the nature of this intensity? What does this mean? In my case, I think that the fundamental thing and the intensity that moves me in this direction to go back and revisit the week of 1922 in the history of modernism in Brazil was an attempt to discover there in 1922 what we had not seen yet. And over time, I realized, especially over the course of the recent years, where I've been studying specifically this for a book that's going to be published next year, written together with Veronica Stigger, what we realized is that most of the things that we know about the week of modern art, about the week of modern art in 1922 in Brazil, I wouldn't say it's false, but it's partial at least, and biased. This both from the point of view, factually speaking, in other words, how the facts played out. There are many different errors of interpretation or mistaken interpretations over this happen. There are examples that I'd like to cite. I cited them in a text, amongst others. Tarsila do Amaral did not participate in the Week of Modern Art in 1922. She wasn't part of it. And when she reached an exhibit that celebrated 50 years later in 1962 in Mass 72, there was a TV team that came and said, "Here we are at Tarsila do Amaral, the muse of the week of 1922. And she said, "I wasn't part of the week of 22. What I know about 1922 is a letter that Malfatti sent when he was there, and telling the whole story and everything. This letter was in Paris. It wasn't even in Brazil at the time. And Anita sent it to me, and I lost this letter. Anita Malfatti sent me this letter, and I lost the letter. It's essential what happened was lost." When she said that, the reporter come and said again, "Anita Malfatti, the muse of 1922. It sounds like a joke, but it's the movement that we talk all the time about 1922. We attempt to project all the story of modernism, social modernism, but of these almost 100 years, we could say the development of modernism, we tend to project on that precise moment. And what we do this is that, on the one hand, we note that there is a greater dynamic of modernism going far beyond the week itself, but we lose the specificity, in other words, what was at stake at that point. And for me, this is extremely important because, to an extent, when we project everything into the week of 22, in that moment, we lose the fact that it's fundamental to know how modernism played out, the watershed in different stages. It's important for us to understand these different stages, because when we understand these different phases, we understand the history of thinking in Brazil, the history of arts in Brazil, and how this issue, for example, of Brazilianness is not an issue, an obvious issue. It's not given. It is a conquest It's a conquest at a time with a genetics, a dynamic when it is transformed into something else. So we can think 1922 is a moment which is much more cosmopolitan than Brazilian. No matter how there were some authors that were creating and wanting to refer the discussion in this direction towards Brazilian modernism, it was not in general. It was not the general interest. It was much more 1924. 23, 24, we're going to have a moment in which, if we take the letters from Mário de Andrade, he's all the time writing, for example, to Carlos Drummond de Andrade, be Brazilian, think Brazilianness. It's an invitation I issued to. This was Mário de Andrade to Carlos Drummond de Andrade, the poet. They're funny answers. I don't feel Brazilian. I feel much more French than Brazilian. And this changes until a moment of anthropophagy. I think we can approach this later.
Yes, we'll go back to that topic. Now, Allan? Hello, you guys. How are you feeling? I would like to thank you all for having invited me to talk about modernity. I guess it's just too many the talks, and I heard that one of the mottos that were referenced by Dadaism, by psychoanalysts, was, for instance, the strength of the dreams as a static source or resource. I can imagine how about nightmares. The nightmares of those who were considering themselves or self-entitled the sponsors of modernism. And did these nightmares go into their texts? And then I ask myself, that they were afraid to be poisoned in their coffee. And when we talk about Brazil, we go through a moment in the end of the 19th century, maybe until the first decades of the 20th century, of sanitarism, eugeny, annihilation, social cleansing. And this is then replaced, I don't know to which extent, by a more modern and progressive liberal discourse or stance. And we can see that there is a plus. What people were afraid of, or it becomes something positive, as long as it was very well curated. As long as whatever has strength will be limited, would be considered less brutal. When I think of 22, I think about the 100 years of the independence. So what happened in São Paulo with so much power and strength? The soccer championship won by São Geraldo team. So this historical moments were moved by the color of the scissors, with statics of the body, of the words, of sound. São Geraldo da Barra Fundo that could not play with white man's team, only with other black people. So the black people, like the Liga da Canela Preta, Black Shin League in a free translation. Then we talk about Mississippi, Soweto, segregation in São Paulo, 1922, also 2022. These soccer teams, in this crack of the 100 years, have played and won. Vaca Brava, Caetano, all these teams. Who are these guys? How did they die? How did they live? Maybe it would be interesting to get to understand their biography. But more than that, I would be interested in understand them as people, creative people, stubborn people, also people that were vengeful. Because in a game, you might, play, you might fool, but you can also hit someone in the stomach and then actually have your revenge. And to me, that is a part of our country. And maybe it wouldn't be good for us to remember that that exists, but it's in every square, in every corner, in every street or back street. And there are many foundations in that. And we use charades, and it's a modern aesthetic. It's very black. to be able to present this idea. This is the whole idea of having a verbal art. You might be for hours and hours, days and days talking about one motto without actually referring to the motto. Why does the aesthetic happen in this country? What is the African source? How will it develop here? How we will contaminate? How will it actually start coming from the fringes? Maybe this isn't news. It might be news for those who are classicists, for those who are just bored, dead in their rich salons. For those who are already working, this is the basis of our language. So when I think about modernity or modernagem, maybe it started in Haiti and fed all the nightmares of the upper strata, the ones that care for the accounts of our credits. What if the sphere is converged in an aesthetic basis for the world? Modernity. What about Luis Gama, cosmopolitan? He was of a mason's store. He was always with his radar on. He was getting to know what was happening. He worked with the Jus Naturalista in Rome, based the legal enslaving racism and the individual rights. And then for Diabo Coxo, the name of this magazine. So when I think about modernity or modernagem, I also think about a very interesting practice to put these people just in the area of biographies, maybe because they have this desire of understanding suffering. But I'm more interested in the language and how these people play with the words. Biographies, for instance, Gossips, Capricho, and other magazines. I really don't care about that. What interests me is how are we able to escape from that? Because when I'm going to talk about these people, we don't understand how they speak, the sophistication of their modern line of thought, to talk about what is the backbone of this country, this ambiguity between the affection and what is perverse, based on our homemade language. Leal did explain this, but biographies of with the wish to go move forward always put Leal, Luis Gama, Lima Barreto, and so many of ours in the individual understanding. In this year we had the week, I don't know what. They don't do that with Sartre. Oh, he joined the infantry. He married Simone. To talk about, to understand Sartre, you have to go to his work. For us to understand this modernity that is so strong and hypocritical, but at the same time it will limit the elites of this country, to help them understand that they do love those people, the people that they actually hit and break their teeth. And this is what Leal explained. The black Portuguese, a play of words with Portuguese and black. She's explaining the relations of this modernity that will choose certain happenings, and not only that, they would sort of filter their fears. I am interested, and I guess many people are interested, and even more so now, in understanding these different aesthetics. This modernity will come wishing to curate. We'll no longer annihilate. We will in prison. We will send them to the hospice. We're going to say, now just can't call this popular culture. It is the faith of colonization. Our dilemma is how we deal with this, with segregation that we have here. And with this fake idea of mixing things. We mix everything except money. This false idea that we live peacefully. And this is something that has happened and still happens. It is interesting when we see that aesthetic values, for instance, black, are considered noisy. They are distorted. And even we have a taste for distortion when we use, when we amplify our sounds, when we create different layers of our characters, or for our characters. We will broaden and we go down to the detail of this intimacy of these people. So they're all dealing with this modernity being mutilated. And I think about 22, the dilemma in the Barra Fundas, where Mário de Andrade actually lived. It's not easy to make folklore a culture that is yours if it's an urban culture. It's easier just to go there and leave it in the outskirts, or it's easier to try to fix something instead of allowing it to be flexible. But if the city is working between the market, the state, the outskirts, it's a bit more difficult to isolate that. And so I consider that this still prevails nowadays. What is considered, bad in different tones, or a bad tone, or a lack of tone. One of the most important projects of Villa-Lobos and Mário de Andrade were to make symphonies out of this. So the 40s was a great dilemma. I'm not canceling them. I'm just presenting their contradictions. We should pick this up, or pick up what is maybe just too distorted, and maybe something that has to be more. Let's bring bossa nova into all this. Of course, you just won't pick and choose elements. You just take people out of the game. You take out the people's thoughts. Modernity is that. However, the risk of that being poisoned in your little cup of coffee still exists. I will go back to Eduardo Sterzi, and maybe if we could establish a connection with the first sentence Allan said regarding revenge. You wrote about that. This is the article that opens your book. It is anthropophagy as a war machine. And we think about anthropophagy as a part of the artistic guerrilla of Oswald de Andrade. And so I ask you, how can we today and nowadays consider the value and the direction of a war machine like Oswald de Andrade in our times? What would be the value and the direction that we should take in terms of an artistic guerrilla? What would be the targets of this war machine in our days? Well, actually, when we consider anthropophagy today, we guess this issue would be less to Oswald and than those who read them. We are working now with modernism, and I would like to remember, for instance, we have a very concrete example, very clear at this moment, and many people probably watched. It is the concert and then a documentary of Eneida. It's a concert is called Yellow, Amarelo in Portuguese. It's on a streaming platform. I don't need to name it, and I guess you just can go and visit it. And it's an interesting documentary or a film. What happens there is actually it links what Allan has said. It is a movement. A basic movement of that movie is considering another modernism, a modernism for our times, in which the basic discourse of Eneida is saying that we were not here, we were not in the municipal theater at that time. There were no black people in that theater, which was built by black hands. And so the whole configuration of the construction of the theater itself in the downtown area of São Paulo. So what he does there is a very interesting. It is to occupy that space and say this space is ours. It has been ours for many years. They will remind us that the black front was created in the stairs of that theater, just a couple of meters, the outside stairs, and then the inside stairs where Mário de Andrade actually makes his famous speech during the Modernist week. And all the side of Inhangabaú and São Bento have to do with the black contemporary culture, with things that come from way back when. So there's a movement of occupation in that sense. All of us that weren't there are now within this theater. What is interesting here is that there is a very, the subtlety of not just making that just simple. Explicitly, they will do the first movement with an excerpt of the prologue by Mário de Andrade, the text that is in the beginning of Policeia Desvairada, the book published by Mário de Andrade in 1922, right after the Modernist week. And to a certain extent, that is sort of a synthesis, a poetic synthesis. José Miguel Wisnicki will read that final text as if it were a transposition for a backdrop of the city, for another public, of issues that were presented during the Modernist week. So when we go from the backdrop of a theater which of course was belonging to the elites and restrictive to other people, so when that goes to the outside, when the movement that poetry does is to open the doors of that theater, to open it to the city, the contradictions just increase. They just so this whole idea, this fear of being poisoned in your morning coffee, is a part of that poem. It's Mário is already working with that, and to a certain extent, they already work with that, already seeing that these sanctions are happening. So this is what I find interesting. Emicida does not start from a clean slate. Let's revisit the modernism, but with a new meaning. What would be the usefulness of modernism now, and not in 2022, in 1922, but yes, in 2022. So there's this permanent presence of modernism, but broadening the field of action. It no longer is what it used to be. And another important point is the moment that they actually see Mário de Andrade, and there is this fundamental excerpt for Emicida in this documentary. It's when he refers to the initial excerpt. It's the single law of the word of I'm only interested in whatever is not mine. So what they do is to take it seriously. I'm only interested in what is mine. And then you put that in a movement. You start a chain reaction, a chain of events that is never ending. I'm only interested in what is mine, and there's not a self or I that will appropriate. So the ownership of property or of an asset is part of anthropophagy. So when you think about that practice of propriety, of ownership, you are to a certain extent, we don't know that that's not happening because of course we are inside a cultural industry and different institutions with all the problems and issues. However, in the ideal plan, you have an endpoint of stabilization, saying that this belongs to someone. So I appropriate myself of that. But this is a sequence of moments. And then Emicida says, this is now mine. It is mine because this will follow. We will continue to have this chain of events after modernism. Yes?
So, let's try. You began with anthropophagy, having included Mário de Andrade, and I would like to propose to Allan de Rosa a question on Mário de Andrade. A specific question for you. It's less concerning the modernist Mário de Andrade and more concerning the man Mário de Andrade, author of Macunaíma. I always wonder, I'm talking out loud, but I want to hear from you. When Mário, when he left for the Northeast in 1928, and he entered he reports this. He tells the story. He published these notebooks, Mario's notebooks, while he was circulating in the northeast of Brazil, in huts and songs, local songs, and the notebooks showed that he was bewildered and fearful. Black religious rituals, he reports. It was like I was in the time of slavery. That was his first commentary of these black religious rituals. Mario, was he less of a tourist and more of an apprentice of what he was doing in the Northeast? Was he also in search of his spear, his ancestral spear, with revenge for the imperialists? Shout for whiten me. It's the opening line, whiten me, of Mario America's improvisation. It's a question for your imagination. How would you imagine? Imagining is more interesting, actually, for the Capricho journal, from his biography. This bewilderment is a fruitful method in the historical moment. Documents to imagine. It looks through the cracks. Fiction opens this garden. Fiction has the obligation of depiction, representation, when the writer is not attempted to try to be a city councilman and to represent the constituency, and he represents himself. Just imagine Mario with his limits of understanding beyond São Paulo, talking about his bewilderment and bizarreness, although he might have had goodwill. You wouldn't expect this sensitivity, this Paulista radar, to organizing a national expedition, goes to Minas Gerais as if it were something very deep, actually. And Minas is very deep. It's a mystery. Minas is Congo. It's tomorrow. It's the tomorrow, yesterday. And what? That leads me to think of the dilemmas, the riddles of people, the dilemmas that people can perceive receiving Mario de Andrade in their backyards, and then thinking that their voices, some of them, which enter as voices of national representation. It's quite emblematic and symbolic. Person who says he's bewildered with how this bizarre African Brazilian religious rituals. It's not that different. He goes to funk. I just discovered funk. With all due respect to Mario, I think he was more worthy than that. What leads me to open my appetite with this is to think of these people, or people from São Paulo, and who defended their mental sanity in their national projects for Brazil, dealing with contradictions in their basement, behind them, sisters, brothers, attuned to what was happening. Not because I didn't say, it doesn't mean that I don't know, just because I didn't say it. So writers, journalists from São Paulo, demanding a true abolition, talking about racial democracy long before Gilberto Freire. We did this. We are integration of this wish, this official wish for whitening. It mutilates us. So what are the dilemmas of these people? I'm interested in this, how these languages developed. People who were left in the back burner. I'm not going to get involved in that. I'm not going to go there. I will go to apply for a job and they throw acid on me. That's a dilemma. Numerous people from the same time that Mario was going in 1928 to the Northeast, and Northeast people were going to downtown São Paulo trying to get jobs in textile factories. So these dilemmas interest me. People from the same family had dinner. Teachers, I'm going to organize a newspaper, and others said, no, I'm going to go out on the corner to bring money back to the table. I'm going to carry boxes as a stevedore, play football, and to defend my mental sanity, I'm going to be stevedore, and other more modern cultures would talk about this as anti-capitalist resistance. Okay, it was. So a lot of things that anticipated modernism, exile, uprootedness, amongst being an individual or mass. The mass is community. He finds a community, but he is part of that community. I think it's very fertile. This place, on the fringes that Mario and so many other people witnessed this perception of the gate. It's not just a gate. The bridge is not a gate, but the bridge is a bridge. Each place is a place. So, a moment in which perhaps it doesn't sound good to assume your whiteness, but in exchange for what? And how do you maintain? You remove white, but maintain whitening. So if we talk about war, it depends on who's talking about war. People may not be able to say that we're in war. The news of a war, it's central. It's on the national news and the federal courts. And some people might sound subversive if they say we're in a war and it's an issue being hung. So how can you exercise a state of war but just playing around? Is this understood by Brazilianness, this so-called Brazilianness, pseudo-modernist? It's so archaic. Nevertheless, when I talk about this mixture of perversity and affection, that's the typical face of these movements. They're valuable in their intent to do perennial aesthetic research. This is valuable, but to present that to the principle of initial national thinking, it's almost laughable. It's to rule out other national projects and thinking that were swept aside and still are. And these projects deal with this arrangement between hope and denial. You know, the Mother Hope, her father, a father decided to register his daughter as Esperanza, hope, but every time people call, we know what rhymes with hope, Esperanza. I believe that this is a dilemma, and it can have found a meaning of fear. It can be defined and sympathized with. Nevertheless, it's considered in its entirety. It could have undergone and been understood with its role to bring also something that moves the movements as we continue now. It was not the only player. And the bewilderment is a blessing. It's a principle of fiction, the beginning of fiction. Even though serene bewilderment, we can enter into this wonderment, talk about the charades and the fears and the desires and the fear of dreams. And literature offers all this. Arts offer all this. They're not always out there in your face, and that's where the fear comes in. Oh, the flavor. This is the base of modernism, but it's a lot of two different ways of interpreting it. It's to perceive something that something needs. It gives taste. To have 7 different senses. You have to have 7 senses. Who's going to understand this? This ability to present something deciphered, and the pleasure of deciphering, the need encoded, decipher the codes. This may have been his quest, Maider's quest, to decipher these methods. I'd like to have a glass of cachaça with Mário de Andrade and have a good conversation with him. I would have loved it. We have little time left, Eduardo and Allan, and let's use these final minutes to close and take a stand on what we've said. I would just like to remind people that I think that Allan talking now, the effacement this nationalist discourse that it performs with an effacement. In the case of Mário de Andrade, it's kind of unfair for us to demand this of him. He never pretended to have a single discourse. On the contrary, his discourse was always one of very attuned to everything that was happening, publishing whatever he could and telling whatever he could. So let's be careful with that, because my fear is that we end up always doing what is to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So he's a central author and one who had to read critically, of course, critically. I myself, in my book, if you read my book, I criticize Mário de Andrade, Osvaldo de Andrade, Sousa Andrade, and all the others who worked with him, but I'm interested in seeing what they have in terms of power at this time, what in their work continues alive and relevant for us now. So I think that we don't necessarily need to choose between one and the other. I think that this need to choose, sometimes we lose different perspectives. I think we go against what is the most essential in the idea, for example, of anthropophagy, in my view, which is, for me, it's a fundamental idea. In other words, it's decisive for me, anthropophagy, the idea that you embody not just the force and strength of another people as a commonplace between anthropophagy. You don't embody the values in the abstract sense of the other. What you embody and incorporate is the other's perspective concerning you and concerning everything. You incorporate this, but not at the final movement you incorporate, period. Now my perspective is that is the right perspective. On the contrary, you expect that you be devoured and that your perspective become part of a flow of various perspectives. So I think that to not think that we can simply undo people who were so decisive for us. I love Mário de Andrade. I'm part of the Mário Flan Club. It's part of a mirror. I love the introduction of the idea of a perennial aesthetic research. I don't have to defend him because he's been defended for 100 years. But Mário is truly essential. And critique is fundamental. I believe that we should not have a favorite politician or author. It's not a matter of kicking them out. On the contrary, it's a matter of taking a step back to play on the same field, to understand their limits which still present other labyrinths. Mário, with all his limits, Mário and other people of that time are truly essential. Some people, if it were not an undesirable position, would not be commented even to. We heard a lot that we were too aggressive. People called us aggressive. Now they're publishing decolonial books. It's a profitable seal. Can even be in the classroom. It's always like that when we present that our shoes are too tight, our corns and bunions hurt. And these people that researched and studied, we should always have them at hand. And as so many others, we may not need to reach to Colina, Paulo Colina, where Paulo Colina, and with poetry in the municipal library, and nobody, and the Secretary of Culture and the teachers and the students in Colina had ever even heard of Paulo Colina in his hometown. Perhaps the rallying cry, and for the banner from 1922, the banner with the armor might fit well for that city, that they want to see themselves that way. So it's not a matter of kicking him out, putting him in game. You play in the attacker or wing or half back or fullback, but you're part of our team. I thank you for the invitation today, and soon we'll be launching Lides e Revides, Lábios e Jogo de Corpo, and Lopes Chaves on the street where Mário. There were poets passing by artists, journalists, and who are here. I'm thankful that you're here. I can't see you from here on this stage, and our art has always been done between the invisible and this flesh, our flesh, as a symbol. The water, the tree, how water evaporates and poisons, and it's been ours and has been for a long time. Thank you very much. Long live Mário de Andrade, all these people that we're going to hear more attentively, even though I might sound aggressive at the beginning. Thank you, Allan, but we're not finished because we have the audience now to hear their questions from. We have 2 questions. I hope that whoever sent the first question concerning Mario, but that Allan has answered the question. The question was, why does Emicida say that Mario is our favorite modernist? I think in a sense, I don't know if Allan would like to add something to that, but we have a question which is more generic. But Mario, I think the question has already been answered. The question, the generic question for both of you, are you able to connect modernism to the peripheral indigenous and black art movements reaching the main museums today? That's the question. I think you've already answered, talking about the municipal theater. Maybe his question, I think it's already been answered. I'd just like to add something to that. Reminding people that when in 2002, there was a week of art on the peripheral communities. It was a very odd word, but significant and beautiful way. The modern week of the peripheries, there's a time shift there, which is extremely strange, but it's very significant. It's a demand for recognition of a force for 2002, the 80 years since the week of 1922. Could not have been. It could have been simply a week of art on the peripheries. In other words, in the past has nothing more to do with me. But that's not how people perceived it. And another thing that I would like to recall is a very beautiful text by Jagers Bell, an indigenous artist, an indigenous thinker, a text called Makunaima, My Grandfather in Me. It's beautiful, this essay. He takes and imagines at a certain point in this text, his conversation with his grandfather, Makunaima. In other words, the character, the indigenous character, who is the origin of Makunaima, and Mário de Andrade goes to extract the mythology from indigenous mythologies through a German, Kaufbrunder, a German author. But Jagers Bell writes in this conversation with his grandfather Makunaima, he says, I'm the grandson of Makunaima, and his grandfather says, and he's kind of, I don't know, criticizing and saying, Mário went there and he stole Makunaima, he took Makunaima from us, and his grandfather enters the scene and opens up, and his grandfather Makunaima, the character says, my grandson, I was the one who wanted to be on the cover of that book. I wanted to be on the cover of that book. For one day, all of us to be there. And I thought this movement was essential. An artist, a huge artist, and a huge thinker on these issues, he realized that to a certain extent we have a dynamic by which to open up room oftentimes occurs problematically in a contradictory way, and it occurs in a unfair way. But if the spaces are open up, if people are going to enter into these spaces and are going to do things that they weren't able to do before, these spaces were limited, something happened, something important happened there. So I would like to close on this message that Jaider left us, I think.
Temos tempinho, Allan. Você gostaria de falar sobre isso?
We do have some time, Allan. Yes, very briefly. More important than representation is confusion. It's a fruitful confusion when you mix things up, when you have a chaos. But in this language between the dark, opacity, and light, This is, to me, one of the ways that we can get rid of certain syndromes from Brazilianism and modernity. One of them, stylistically speaking, is the opening of new pathways, abertura de caminhos, or salvation, or maybe of the benevolence, the figure of the benevolent. Sometimes this is concentrated in a little droplet of good intentions. And sometimes we will choose that seed or that banner because we know how that will reverberate and echo. We know that it has become a totem. We know that that is a pillar, and this is where we will do our graffiti or illustrate. We know that the foundation isn't solid. I was one of the persons who organized the week of modern art in the periphery. Why did we do that? Because we knew we had our rough edges, but we also knew that there are different ways of attracting. There are different ways that we know that when we present certain emblems and signs, this will touch certain nerves, it will reach certain nuclei. And it is an old principle, ancestral principle, art taking over spaces. Art that will open spaces, not necessarily someone that will believe that they were the person who actually opened those spaces. And as I said, and I've referred to certain names, people were already fighting for their space, gardening their spaces before the word space or modernity actually was presented to them. And this is where it is worthwhile. What is this notion of opening permanent spaces? We also conclude there is in the Águas de Homem Pretos, these are ancestral letters that I learned with Professor Lígia Ferreira. She gave me a news about a guy named Mariano, and he was being freed in 1881 with the benevolence. You had a priest, and he only has 1 second to express. When everybody says, we are opening the path for you, we are granting you freedom, what do you want? But you have to be and behave this way now that you're a free man. You have to work. And he only says one thing. He says, my name, Mariano. No, now it's Mariano Gama. The name of the enemy. Thank you, bye. That's him. How did Mariano die? When what was a party that he started and opened? These spaces were open and the other way around. They were very well defended nests. Not everything has to be out in the open. Sometimes you just have to decipher these things. I learned that in these dark among the big initiators and those that are just out there whispering, that is where the danger is. That is where we can fruitify. And we know that all these syndromes of the Brazilian elitists, that it's in these different symbols. It is in the hero, the macho that will open our paths. It is in the Jesuit. And I follow, and I'm very nimble. Thank you. I would like to close this round table with maybe unheard of stance. There's this intellectual tradition of always when there are divergences, when we see divergencies, when there is controversy, there's a final gesture of conciliation. I would not like to do that. I guess we had 2 different standpoints that were quite different here, very clear, produced from different starting points, and we have to learn, in general terms, we have to learn to deal with these divergencies. With regards to the cultural history, my proposal is that we shouldn't just be worried about the meaning of modernism and the week of modernism. Allan, when I was doing my homework, getting to know my guests, he said, He said it was just like a musical night in the theater. But when we deal with the history, cultural history, it doesn't make sense to try to go down to the truth of it, or the total information about that. What matters in the cultural history, what is the meaning, what is the position that we will bring to that happening? Greater, lesser, more prominent, more lateral. Cultural history belongs to us. Modernism belongs to us. These are the problems with which we have to deal today, and we should try to maybe accommodate things. And maybe one thing we cannot deny: the week of modern art left us a legacy of creativity in which we are intertwined and at the same time segregated in Brazil. Thank you very much.
Lembrem o convite.
We invite you all. The authors will be signing in the Travessa bookshop to sign their books. Thank you.